Kawhi Leonard is one of the best players in the NBA today, and he's allowed the San Antonio Spurs to stay in championship contention, even as the roster's gotten older. An incredibly efficient 20-point scorer, he also has the potential to be the greatest perimeter defender in the history of the NBA, and top all that off with his team-first mentality and quiet nature. Kawhi Leonard's great for San Antonio. But for the Spurs to acquire him in the 2011 draft, they had to trade away George Hill, who was one of Greg Popovich's favorite players. It was a tough decision, and they had to move him to the Indiana Pacers for their draft pick to select Kawhi Leonard. But now we got to ask ourselves, what would have happened if that trade never occurred and Kawhi Leonard found himself on the Indiana Pacers and never San Antonio? What happens exactly? Let's take you to the 2011-2012 season. Darren Collison is Indiana's point guard, who's in the same vein as George Hill, not great at anything, but pretty decent at most things, so not a bad option at the point guard spot. Paul George uses this season to show that he's a capable three-point shooter, defensive player, an athlete, and potentially someone who Indiana could really invest in long-term, an exciting young prospect. But Danny Granger is the scorer of the team, putting up about 18 points per game. But the real surprise comes from the second unit, as it does not take Indiana long to learn they've got something with Kawhi Leonard. The moment he steps onto an NBA floor, he's a defender, no doubt about it. He can play on that side of the floor and fit right in. But he also shows the ability to play within a team system, and his outside shot is better than they thought it would be this quickly. Add to that his athleticism and ability to go out into the open floor. Exciting things coming off of Indiana's bench, and when you take their toughness inside with both David West and Roy Hibbert's shot blocking and rim protection, they actually pushed the Miami Heat to 6 games in round 2 this year, and Kawhi Leonard actually has a few defensive moments on LeBron James, enough for LeBron to go, this kid's pretty alright. But that being said, Indiana's still years away. The Miami Heat will move on to the NBA Finals, and in the Western Conference, George Hill and the San Antonio Spurs, they're neck and neck with the OKC Thunder, and they do take a 2-0 series lead, but the young Oklahoma City Thunder surprise a lot of people, defeating the veteran Spurs in a 6-game series. But then they get quickly reminded that they're not there just yet as LeBron James captures his first NBA championship. Now the 2012 draft remains unchanged. Anthony Davis goes number 1. And then if we can move on to the 2012-2013 season, Danny Granger misses the majority of it with injuries. And so the duo of Paul George and Kawhi Leonard are asked to step their games up. Paul George definitely does. His scoring takes an uptick, and he replaces Danny Granger as the Pacers' go-to guy when it comes to offense. And Kawhi Leonard is asked to start, and his shooting efficiencies improve, which is always good, but he really reveals himself as one of the better defensive players in the league. And Indiana as a whole, their perimeter defense is really tough to deal with. Darren Collison is still the starting point guard for Indiana. But also another surprise, Lance Stevenson becomes a ball handler off the bench for them and someone who can provide some offense as a sixth man. And with Indiana's toughness, defense, outside shooting, they're able to push the Miami Heat to 7 games, and LeBron James officially learns, okay, this Kawhi dude is going to be a thorn in my side for a while. Oh, and Roy Hibbert's height isn't exactly fun to deal with around the basket either. However, the Miami Heat, as we know, they won this series in 7 games over Indiana. They still managed to win this one and go back to the NBA Finals, but it's clear the Pacers are definitely on the upswing. And on the other side of things in the Western Conference, we start to see the Spurs dip without Kawhi. They become a middle ground Western Conference team right in the thick of things, clearly not the best team in the West anymore. But they do get a little fortunate, because as they see the OKC Thunder in round 2 of the playoffs this time, it's without Russell Westbrook, who went down because Patrick Beverley is a super dirty player, and as a result, OKC, they just don't have the juice to win without Russell Westbrook. So we get our first Miami Heat and San Antonio Spurs NBA Finals in 2012-2013, and Miami originally won this series without Kawhi Leonard, so they definitely win this one in probably 6 games. Now the 2013 draft is where we start to see the dominoes fall. Anthony Bennett still goes number 1 overall, but remember, San Antonio's not as good without Kawhi, so their record drops, therefore they move up higher in the NBA draft, so they select Andre Roberson with the 25th overall pick. Reggie Bullock still goes to the Clippers at number 26, but 27 is interesting because initially the Denver Nuggets had this one and they selected Rudy Gobert and then traded him to Utah. In this situation, a new team has the 27th overall pick, and that's the Minnesota Timberwolves. They select Rudy Gobert at center. This is really bad for the rest of the NBA moving forward, although for this very season, Gobert would not make them better at all because he barely played. And if you're asking why would they select him when they already have Nikola Pekovic, they're concerned with his health because Pekovic up to this point had not played an entire season. Now on to the 2013-2014 season, the Indiana Pacers, favorited by some to actually come out of the Eastern Conference. They've been playing together for a while. The chemistry as well as the toughness is at an all-time high. And as for the defense, well, there's a stretch in the beginning of the season where Indiana is putting up some historic numbers on that side of the floor because Kawhi Leonard and Paul George are a nightmare for the majority of NBA wings. To go along with what they're doing inside, it's almost impossible to score on these dudes. Paul George also finally eclipses 20 points per game, and Kawhi Leonard becomes a bit more assertive with his offense as well. So Indiana's rolling. Lance Stevenson also seems like a shoo-in for 6th man of the year. But as we all remember, something happened to this team. Whether it be off-the-court stuff, I want the ball, no, I want the ball. Of course, Paul George was involved in a few things that you can Google if you really want to. There's also Lance Stevenson, who's always liable to do or say something really weird. And Indiana started to dip. And especially on the defensive side of the floor where they really hung their hats. And it seemed like the once favorites to win the Eastern Conference were really shaky going into the postseason. Now while all this is happening, Kawhi Leonard just keeps his head down, keeps playing defense and playing hard, but that doesn't really go for the rest of the roster, and while they still make it to the conference finals against the Miami Heat, they're clearly not the team that they were at the beginning of the year. LeBron James wearing the wrong number, don't talk about it, it's fine. He goes through them in only 6 games. And once again, the Oklahoma City Thunder and the San Antonio Spurs get matched up. This time, Russell Westbrook's there, and without Kawhi Leonard, the Spurs' old age really shows. They don't have a chance against OKC's athleticism. And then the Thunder go through the Clippers in 5 or 6 games. And then we get the Heat and OKC in the finals. But remember, Dwayne Wade at this point, the injuries were getting up to him. A little bit slower, shot wasn't falling. So Oklahoma City, they capture their first NBA championship. And then as a result of this, LeBron James says, okay, I gotta get the hell up out of here. I gotta go to Cleveland so I can keep on winning. Sorry, Miami. 2014 draft has some slight shuffle from the Spurs being once again not as good, but none of it's really worth mentioning. However, for Indiana, Paul George goes down in, I'm pretty sure, an Olympic game that didn't really matter. And so as a result, he is out for pretty much the entire 2014/2015 season, which means it's Kawhi time in Indiana. An offensive breakout, 18 points per game while maintaining his efficiency and able to do it from outside as well as inside. Kawhi Leonard really shows himself as a capable offensive player. And of course, off ball, he's still fantastic defensively, rebounding-wise. And Indiana, who originally did not make the playoffs, they actually win 42 games and make the 6th seed, which really is going to shake up the draft as we see in a second. Now, they still lose in round 1 to the Chicago Bulls, but Kawhi Leonard definitely showing that he has potential to be a star player in the NBA for Indiana. Now, before we go into the rest of the playoffs, let's see how this affects the draft. Brooklyn Nets, who originally made the playoffs this year, are now in the lottery because of Indiana making it. They don't have their draft pick because they never do. Atlanta has their pick from trading away Joe Johnson years ago, and so the Atlanta Hawks end up in the lottery, and they actually end up with the 11th pick in the NBA draft. As for the NBA Finals, LeBron James does all he can against the Golden State, but unfortunately without Kyrie Irving as well as Kevin Love, Steph Curry and the crew capture their first of potential many NBA championships of this generation. Now on to the 2015 NBA Draft. Atlanta's got the 11th pick. They're already pretty damn good when it comes to their front court with Al Horford and Paul Millsap, but their wings need some help scoring-wise. They're good shooters, maybe not the best scorers. They decide to select Devin Booker to hopefully help them out in that area. And we all know how good Devin Booker ends up becoming, so shout out to that. The Utah Jazz end up at number 12. They select Miles Turner because you got to remember they don't have Rudy Gobert in this situation. 13th, the Phoenix Suns end up with Trey Lyles. And then if we can rejoin our friends, the Indiana Pacers, they end up with the 17th overall pick in this draft. They're not really impressed with anything around that area. And because they're letting Roy Hibbert walk in free agency, he just kind of sucks now, to be honest. They need to find themselves a big man. And luckily for them, the T-Wolves, after having Gobert emerge a little bit, but not affect their record, they contemplate trading away Gorgui Dieng to free up space for Gobert down low, and that's only amplified when they draft Karl Anthony Towns. And so they're like, okay, Indiana, you want Gorgui Dieng, give us the 17th pick. And so Indiana's got themselves a nice new big man. And then if we move on to free agency, as we know, LaMarcus Aldridge was the big splash. He ended up signing with the San Antonio Spurs. No Kawhi Leonard. They're getting too old. He's not going there. He's going to his number 2 choice, the Phoenix Suns. Yeah, I don't know, man. He picked the Suns. I don't frickin' know. And this is interesting for a few reasons. Number one, because LaMarcus Aldridge signed with the Suns. But also, Phoenix had to make some moves to free up the cap space. They traded away Marcus Morris to the Detroit Pistons for a bunch of BS. But in this situation, Indiana beats Detroit to the punch because they're intrigued by having Paul George and Kawhi Leonard with another two-way player at the power forward spot. Now this does mean that Thad Young never ends up on Indiana a year later, but they're pretty content with Marcus Morris. Now what happens to Monte Ellis because he originally signed with the Pacers in this offseason? He's not going here. They got Kawhi and Paul George. He ends up on the Atlanta Hawks, who don't know how good Devin Booker is yet. They need some scoring punch on the wings. They have the money to do it. They were actually interested in Monte if you use Google, which surprised me, but hey, if it works out for you. Now to the 2015-16 season, Marcus Morris fits in beautifully with Indiana, a guy who can defend multiple positions as well as hit an outside shot. Paul George makes a triumphant return. Kawhi Leonard continues his offensive surge from a year ago as he and Paul George both average around 20 points per game, and Gorgui Dieng's defense takes a step up under Frank Vogel. And speaking of that defense, Indiana remains the best defensive team in the league with Kawhi and Paul George in the starting lineup. And if we can fast forward to the playoffs, they meet Toronto in round 2, and Paul George nearly beat these guys by himself. So Kawhi Leonard with him, Indiana's going on to the Eastern Conference Finals. And LeBron James has to deal with these guys once again. And they push the Cleveland Cavaliers for as much as they can handle, while LeBron once again gets to see his best friend Kawhi Leonard, which is not fun for LeBron whatsoever. And for parts of the series, it actually seems like the Pacers are the better team. But as we know, these Cavaliers went through the 73-9 Golden State Warriors, so LeBron is still able to edge it out. And then he would go on to put on one of the greatest performances in the history of the NBA in the next round. But he also knows that Indiana is going to be a headache, and they're not old. They're going to be around for a while. As for the Western Conference, Phoenix only wins 45 games because LaMarcus Aldridge is great, but his backcourt misses a hell of a lot of games due to injuries. And this would go on to shake up the draft lottery pretty significantly, actually, because everybody who was originally after number 4 moves up one. So Minnesota drafts Chris Dunn one spot earlier than originally. Number 5, the Pelicans take Dragon Bender because they're intrigued by him and Anthony Davis next to each other. And then Sacramento goes with Buddy Hield at number 7. They do not trade their draft pick in the end. And then the Toronto Raptors at number 9 go with Marquise Chris to hopefully solidify their power forward position. Just hold on one second. Minnesota T-Wolves are a friggin' cheat code. They have Andrew Wiggins, who's athletic as all hell at the wing, Chris Dunn, and Rudy Gobert down low, and then Karl Anthony Towns is in the middle of all of it. Rest in peace the rest of the NBA if this lineup ever happened. Now if we can go to free agency, Al Horford, he signed with the Celtics in real life, but this time he sees the Indiana Pacers as the better option. He chooses to sign there. Now if you're going to ask, how the hell could they afford Al Horford? Let me give you some real contracts. Darren Collison, $5 million a year. Marcus Morris, $5 million a year. Gorgui Dieng, Rodney Stuckey, about $9 million total. And sure, Kawhi Leonard and Paul George combined for about $40 million, but given that the NBA salary cap jumps up to over $90, Al Horford is a member of the Indiana Pacers. He fits in beautifully in terms of defense as well as being a versatile offensive player. The one thing they were missing out of one of their big man spots. And so now Indiana has put together a hell of a two-way team who can really challenge the Cleveland Cavaliers in the Eastern Conference moving into the 2016/2017 season. And you can already see the Indiana Pacers and the Cleveland Cavaliers being a rivalry for a long damn time. And while the Pacers have not won a championship yet, with Kawhi Leonard remaining there, they're definitely poised to do it. See if LeBron James can actually take them out. And so that's what potentially could have happened if Kawhi Leonard was never traded to San Antonio, or this might all be a big lie.